The wrong introduction on there. That's not a very good start. Hello, and welcome to ARTEFACTLive with Scott McArthur, where we look at the art and science of storytelling. We're not doing natural history this week. I think I played the long intro there. I must have hit the wrong button. Sorry. We're actually looking at lost knowledge and storytelling, so I'm really quite excited about it. But thank you for joining me. If it's your first time here and you're coming in from the Empathy Engine Facebook group, if you want to comment, you'll see there's a little link here in the picture. You need to click that link inside the Facebook group, and that will mean that your name will appear in the chat. It's a bit fiddly, but unfortunately with Restream and StreamYard, you've got to do that if you want your name to appear from a Facebook group. It's a pain. I've complained. I've given them some feedback. They say they're working on it. They've been quite good at Restreaming, working on these things, so fingers crossed that it works. So what happens is, you see here, I've got my name and good morning. I just posted that in the Facebook group from my phone. And if I hadn't done that, it would just say Facebook user. So if you don't mind doing that, folks, that would be terrific. That would be really, really good. So what's been happening? It's been an interesting couple of weeks. I'm working really hard at trying to consolidate this idea of storytelling and trying to understand how it mixes, or how the confluence is between storytelling in the traditional sense and storytelling in the digital world. Now, just this last few weeks, there's been announcements in nearly all the social media platforms about new things they're doing, new ways they're gathering data, new formats. It's actually getting a bit silly. But one of the ones that I am a little bit interested in, I'm not going to say I'm hugely interested in it, but a little bit interested in, is something that YouTube is doing, and it's called YouTube Shorts. And what that's about is, rather than doing your, when you normally do your film and you do it that way, if you did it for a format like this, but you also know that in some platforms like TikTok, they do it like this on the sort of so you've got landscape versus portrait. Well, YouTube have just announced that they're doing this YouTube Shorts thing. It's only available in India at the moment. It's in beta, but if you put the hashtag shorts in the title or in your description, and as long as your title's below 40 characters, it actually picks up as a YouTube short. And that's quite interesting, because I did it for the first time yesterday, and I just talked about one of my favourite sayings for less than a minute, and it's had quite a few views, so there does seem to be some interest. But of course, that happened in LinkedIn stories as well, and as far as I've seen, that's died in almost death. So I think a lot of these things, a lot of these companies, a bit like me and everybody else who's trying to do this stuff, we're just touching stuff and trying to see what works for us. So I'm not sure if storytelling is something that's going to work in the very, very short form. But let's wait and see. I'm very open-minded about it. So back to today. Well, today I've got a guest coming back, and it's quite interesting because Peter Edge is my guest today. Now, if you watched episode 11, I personally think it's one of the best episodes I've ever done. And Peter is an ex-copper, a comedian, a walker, and a jolly nice fella, and I like him, and I like the way his brain works. And when we had the last show, and I'm going to show you the little reel at the end just to show you just how funny it was, but also how informative it was. But at the end of that show, we had a chat about what Peter's been doing. I'll let him talk about it himself in a minute, but there's something else he's interested in, and that's this idea of lost knowledge. Now, that appeals to me. You see my Indiana Jones fedora there. It appeals to me, and I'm very interested in it. And I've actually done a fair bit of it in my professional work when I used to be an HR professional, of which I'm in full recovery. But it's something I've worked a lot with myself in the past, so I'm interested to hear what Peter's got to say about it. Let me just see who's on. Oh, here we are. We've got one of the other speakers on. Derek. Hello, Derek. Nice to see you. It's really good that you've managed to come along this week. I hope everything's okay at home. Now, let me just get Peter on. Let me just see if I can hit the right button here, Peter. Hey, there you are. In all your glory. Good morning.
Good morning, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How's sunny Liverpool?
It's sunny, like you say. It is, in fact, sunny. In fact, it was quite sunny yesterday as well. I think that's 2 days on the run. But
absolutely. It's 21
that's summer
degrees.
Gone.
Yeah.
That was our summer. That was it.
We had frost this morning, and then within an hour and a half, it was 20 degrees.
Yeah.
Bonkers.
Brilliant.
Do you know I look like I've got jaundice or something? Look how yellow I am. What am I doing here? What have I done? Hang on. Move that away. No, that's a bit better. Oh, dear.
But you're down south, so you're all tanned down there. You've all been on there.
Yeah. It's The only
on
thing
the
about the weather
beds.
getting better at this time of year, Peter, is that the tourists will start coming back any minute. We've had a year off the tourists. It's been amazing. The only problem, of course, is we've had a year off the pubs as well, so you can't even get to the decent pubs. We've got here's our good morning. Hiya, Doug. How you doing? Thanks very much for joining us. It's appreciated. Doug works over in Bath. He's a terrific chap. I've known Doug for a long time, haven't I, Doug? So today, lost knowledge, mate. What we're going to talk about? What's this all about? How's your involvement?
What's it all about? Well, good question. Good way to start on it. What's it all about?
Yeah.
Well, it's for me, lost knowledge. I think for me, my interest in it all started when I was at uni. I was studying psychology and communications, and an awful lot of what we talked about was how culture and skills are transferred through storytelling and myth.
Yeah.
And it's really apt that your opening sequence is a campfire, because of course in many of those sort of cultures around the world, this sort of transfer of skills and myth through storytelling took place around campfires. So you think about cultures like Native Americans and the Aboriginals, Kalahari Bushmen, whoever it might be, who never had any notebooks, any computers, any laptops, anything like that to record their thoughts on and to transfer them across to other people. It's all done through storytelling. And so that really sort of got me thinking. And then sort of later on in life, there were a few things which really sparked my knowledge, and I use a story, and I'll tell it now, seeing as it's a storytelling episode. It would seem right, and it's a story about a friend of mine called Jed. Now, Jed retired as a primary school teacher a couple of years ago now. He'd come late to teaching. He was for many years he worked on the production line at Ford's in Hale Wood here in Liverpool. But for one reason or another, he left there, and he took to teaching. And he took to it like a duck to water. He was a great teacher. The kids loved him, the parents loved him, all the other teachers loved him. He was a great primary school teacher. And a couple of months before he went and retired, he went into the head teacher's office and he said, "I'm leaving in a couple of months." And the head teacher sort of looked at him and he said, "Sit down, Jed." And he says, "Do you know what? If I could bottle what you have as a teacher, this wouldn't just be a good school. This would be an outstanding school."
Oh, wow.
And Jed thought, well, that's really nice. That's a really nice thing to say. And when he told me this story, I found myself thinking, well, hang on, I think there's another view here. Because that head teacher recognized in Jed qualities, skills, experience, wisdom, X factor, whatever you want to call it, that had the potential to take his school from being just good to outstanding.
Right.
He had a member of staff there that was different to his other members of staff, who had skills that were different to his other members of staff. And he just let him walk out the door.
God, right.
Without doing anything to capture those skills, to bring them to bear on his organization, his school, for its betterment. He had the potential there to make his school better by utilizing the skills and abilities that Jed had, and he let them go. And that really bothered me, because it made me think, people like you and I can sit here and say, what do we know? What makes us good or great at what we do?
Yes.
And then think, well, what happens to all of that when we move on, change jobs, God forbid, get knocked down by a bus?
Yes.
Where's it go? And where does the value of it go? Because it is valuable. It's valuable stuff. And if it's valuable, ask yourself the question, what's the cost of replacing it? And for me, it just struck me that the organizations, this is happening every day in organizations. And surely there must be something that you can do about it. So I did quite a bit of reading around it, and basically came up with my own sort of take on it, and I've been delivering that here and there ever since.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no.
It's a fascinating area, this, because in all my years, and it's probably the best part of a quarter of a century, believe it or not, working in organisations, people often say, what's the low hanging fruit? What's the thing we could do now that would make a difference? The first thing, ironically, is probably stop performance management, because it's just a load of nonsense. But the second thing is knowledge management. I have never, honestly, Peter, I've done, they call it, well, you're from the police force, you probably have, after action reviews or post event, reviews, whatever they call them. There's all sorts of names for it.
Yeah.
And I remember I was given a job. I was working in Bath, actually, where I met Doug, who's on the call. And I was asked to run what they called a community of practice. That jargon's kind of faded. It was in about maybe 5-6 years ago. It's faded now, but I don't know why, but it has. And what our objective was, and it's absolutely ridiculous when you consider it was supposed to be a grown-up organisation. Well, it was the army, it was the military.
Yeah.
It was the procurement in the military. And we were looking at all these projects. Some of these projects were what you call mega projects. These were £1 billion projects. Now, if you're building a platform, that's more than £1 billion to build a submarine or a ship or whatever it is. And you know what? They were effing garbage at it. They used to spend, I probably shouldn't say, but an absolute fortune on consultants, right? Yeah. The consultants would come in, they would do the job, they would do it well, they would have some sort of knowledge transfer program as part of the deal, and then 6 months later, 2 years later, the consultants would be back because they'd all forgotten what they'd done in the previous project.
Yeah, and that's very much a part of it. And one of the first things I did was read a book by a fellow called David DeLong, who wrote a book, I think, called Lost Knowledge: Confronting the Threat of an Aging Workforce. So it was very much focused on, people getting to the end of their lives and organizations trying to capture what they'd learned throughout. He describes two different types of knowledge: this explicit knowledge and this tacit knowledge, amongst other things. But just to sort of explain what he means by that, explicit knowledge is the stuff that's easily codified, that can be shared sort of independent of its human source, stuff you can write down, you can save to a hard drive, all of that sort of stuff. Whereas the tacit knowledge is more of the cognitive stuff, the skills and abilities, that X factor that I described, that sets Jed aside. I think the example he uses in the book is, that's the book. Yeah. The tacit knowledge is almost like, how to ride a bike. Everyone knows that you can. Everyone knows what you're meant to do, but the actual knowledge of how to ride a bike is the tacit side of things. I describe it a little bit like, I know Derek's on the call, and you've probably read a few Haynes manuals in your day, Derek. You probably have as well, Scott. But you pick up a Haynes manual, which has got everything for your particular car. It's got everything in there that you need to know. But I wouldn't have a clue where to start. I wouldn't know how to. All the knowledge is there, but I wouldn't know how to. So that's that's how the likes of DeLong describe that. And the way I look at it is, it all boils down to, in the end, looking at your organization, doing a really sort of in-depth, what I call, the key word for me, which is profile. So profiling your organization, so looking at, what you do, what you produce, what sort of service area you're in, where do you fit in the whole scheme of things, what level are you at? And that eventually sort of brings you around to, the people in your organization. And I use the word profile to sort of describe this sort of process that I'm talking about here. So the P of profile represents the people, so who does what, who performs better than anybody else, who oils the wheel, who's the go-to person in that organization, who's the person that if they didn't turn into work tomorrow, you would really, really feel it.
Yes.
And we probably all worked in organizations or teams or businesses, whatever, that had that, that one or two or three people, whoever they may be, who wouldn't necessarily be at the top of the organization. It doesn't have to be there, because, knowledge management and the lost knowledge sort of dilemma is not necessarily focused on the high value, not necessarily focused at the top of the organization. It's focused on the knowledge that has the greatest value.
Yes.
So you've got to look at your people, who does this, who does that, who's responsible for that, who has the corporate memory, for instance, who regularly performs better than anyone else, who do you rely on?
Yes.
And then you recognize those people.
Mm-hmm.
And that process of recognizing those people gives you the opportunity to risk assess the possibility of losing them.
Yes. Derek makes a very interesting point here, Peter. The trouble with KM, knowledge management, is that organisations automatically think it means IT, information technology. The best KM activities occur by the water cooler or the coffee machine.
Or, it's not the water cooler and the coffee machine, the modern day equivalent of the campfire.
Yeah.
That is exactly right. And that's it. And you don't, you will have read some of the other stuff that I've written, like on that, my article on lazy leaders don't listen. To recognize all those people, you've got to be listening all the time as a leader. So, recognition it's not some shallow sort of process. You've really got to know what people contribute to your organization. And this is all inextricably linked, for instance, with things like performance review processes, assessment, annual appraisal processes, that sort of thing, which again very often are incredibly shallow and one way. It all seems to be in many places about, oh, well, you've done a great job, here's a bar of chocolate and a gold watch, but never does it look the other way and think, how much value does this person bring to this organization? And if they bring more value than the next person, then what are we doing to bridge that gap? What are we doing to capture that value and that knowledge and that way of working, that X factor, whatever it might be?
Yes.
And then bring it back, interpret it, and bring it back to bear on the organization itself. But there's very little. I describe this as there's no shared perception of risk. You'd be surprised the number of times I ask the question, if I'm speaking to businesses, who maintains a strategic risk register, and if they do, is knowledge on it, or the loss of knowledge on it? And you'd be surprised how many people sort of sit there and go, do we do that? I don't think so. No, don't do that. And yet it's a hugely valuable resource. There's the cost. When I was putting all this stuff together, I looked. There was a report on the internet, I think by Oxford Economics, called "The Cost of Brain Drain," and they were talking about the average cost. And that's taking in all the various costs, so recruitment, backfill, retraining, all this sort of stuff. But the average cost of losing someone who gets paid £25,000 a year or more, the average cost across 5 of the biggest sectors, from retail through to legal, was just over £30,000, and that ranged from about 25 in retail to up to 40 in legal. And when I looked at it, there was a forum running alongside this, and everyone was going, no, that's way too much. That's far too much money. And then some of the big hitters started coming in. Some of the big HR people had said, no, actually, that's really quite conservative. So even just in terms of monetary assessment, it's a big thing that desperately needs looking at. But no one wants to do it. No one wants to take responsibility for it.
It's a really interesting one, this, because there's 2 things that I think we could discuss. One of those is smoking rooms. I remember back in the day, again, I was working at KPMG, And if you were the most junior consultant, so you'd probably been a director in a company, or you'd been running your own business, or you'd been, senior manager in a company, you'd be brought into KPMG and you're at the bottom. It doesn't matter how senior you were in corporate, you go to the bottom and you got to work your way back up again. Yeah. And one of the things, if you smoked, you'd be put in the smoking room. We used to literally put people in the smoking rooms. They'd be there for 3 or 4 hours a day, listening to what's going on, in the background. And I'll tell you what, I remember the briefs that we used to get. I mean, I didn't smoke, so I never did it. But I remember, I never smoked anything legal anyway. But I remember, so you're not
cautioning you at this stage, Scott.
But but I remember there was one girl called Helen, and she did it for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. And every Friday we used to have a debrief, and she'd come in and she'd have like a list, of knowledge that now, and again, Derek's point, they tried to codify it. It's just not something you can codify because it just changes all the time. It's, but that's one point. But the other point, and I think it's probably, I'd like to hear your perception of it. But this is again something so bloody obvious, but companies don't do it. Why don't they do it?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of traditional sort of barriers to it. As I say, one, no one's got any real ownership of the problem. So, if you're going to have an effective knowledge management strategy in a business, or, I mean, that's a very fancy way of saying it, isn't it? Knowledge management strategy, even if you're just seriously looking at this area, someone needs to own it, and it needs to be someone with a bit of clout for a start. People don't think that they've got time for it. They don't think they've got the resources for it. And there's very often a lot of sort of, I suppose, what the change management people would call parochial self-interest. And they say, oh, I've got this knowledge and it's mine. And knowledge is power. And I can't share it.
You're a bit like Golem there, mate.
Yes, knowledge, my pretty. Yeah. It's well, it is. But people, it's a bit like all those people. You Croesuses of this world who sit there, just look at their money and think that's great, and then all of a sudden they shuffle off this mortal coil and they can't spend it.
Yeah.
And it's almost, knowledge is like that. It's a currency, isn't it?
Yeah.
I do wonder whether there's someone going to be ringing round in future saying, "Did you work for KPMG? Were you forced to go in the smoking room?"
Yeah.
Make a claim.
You can just see it. Yeah, that's a whole other show, mate. That's a completely other show. But you volunteered for it, incidentally, in case there's any of these
I'm sure.
Have
you been disadvantaged by smoking?
Sorry.
Have you been disadvantaged by smoking? Call our specialist smoking lawyers on 6321.
That's a whole other show, mate. That's a whole other show. But let's just look at some comments. There's some comments here that I think we should perhaps have a look at. This is one from Doug. I like the Egyptian idea of the second death, when your name is said for the last time, and how this connects to stories and knowledge. Yeah, that's lovely. I actually use that with my kids. And I say, Samantha's father died about 2 years now ago, and he was very dear to her and very dear to the children and me. And I said to them, you need to keep talking about him, because that keeps him alive, because I've got, a friend in Australia who might be tuning in just now, but I don't see him from one year to the other, but he's there. But I tell the story. He's still alive, but I'm still telling stories about him, because I think if that's a really lovely point. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I've heard it, but it's one of those things that you hear that washes out, and it's not until you start talking about something like this that you actually realise how powerful and how relevant it can be.
Yeah. It's where the corporate storytelling comes into this, because if you I've certainly experienced corporate legends, where people are remembered who left the company 20 years ago. Now, of course, companies aren't lasting as long now, and that was another supplementary I wanted to ask you about, changes in company structures. We'll come back to that if that's all right. But yeah. But I think the company myth idea I know some people like Jordan Peterson thinks it's much more important than others, but I still think the company stories are actually very helpful. And a good induction program isn't actually about this is how we do things around here. It's more about these are how the customers interact with us, and this is an example of it. Here's a story. Is that something you've encountered at all?
Yeah. Well, very, very much in the police, and one of the examples I use in the talk that I do is it's a headline from the Sunday Times from a couple of years ago, and the headline it's got a picture of Philip Glenister and Keeley Hawes is on the bonnet of an Audi Quattro or something from the program Ashes to Ashes or Life on Mars. You'll probably remember them.
Yeah.
And the headline says, "Met stumped by disappearing CID."
Right.
And the article goes on to describe how the Assistant Commissioner for Crime and Operations, someone that I know actually, has implored every detective retiring that year to stay on to mentor junior colleagues, because they realize, because of the vagaries of the recruitment process perhaps 25, 30 years ago, that all of a sudden they're going to lose this huge tranche of experience and wisdom in terms of investigative ability. And this is the biggest police force in the country, with national responsibilities for terrorism and various other things. How many films have you seen where they say, we're going to send someone from Scotland Yard? That's the one. How do you find these pictures so quick? You must have fingers like Liberace.
Hey mate, I've done 230 hours of live streaming. You get quite good at it. I mean, my friend's actually on that I do. He's on Twitch. He's saying he's here. We do a live show on a Friday night, and we have hundreds of people on it, right? And we've got thousands in our Facebook group. And trying to keep up with these people is an art. And I tell you what, it's taught me some things that you couldn't bottle in. You go, there's a story in there, isn't there? Anyway, so I interrupted you.
That would have taken me about an hour to find that one. But it did. It did take me about an hour to find that reference. That's just one of the examples. And if we don't think it's happening, it's happening there. It's happening there, and it's happening. As an example, that's happening in just about every police force, every one of the 43 Home Office police forces up and down the country. But it's not just there. You read that David DeLong book, and you were talking about storytelling in terms of corporates and that sort of thing. He uses an example in there from NASA, from their jet propulsion labs or whatever it is. And they used to every month get together and they would just tell stories, and it would be stories about things like how they put the rover machine together that they were planning to send to Mars, or how they put this, that, and the other together when they were going to the moon. It's stuff that puts in context everything that they're doing. So all those manuals, or those Haynes manuals I described before, it puts it in context, and it gives you that framework to understand, if you like, the data, the explicit knowledge that is so easily stored and sits on hard drives or shelves gathering dust.
Yes, it does seem rather silly. Anyway, let's just there's Derek's mentioned. I don't know what this is about. Well, I think I know, but I'm not sure. Another good story is that of Fred's head, problems that cropped up with the Victoria line when Fred left TfL. Derek, I've just sent you the link. If you want to come on and tell us about that, you're welcome to join me and Peter for a minute or two, because I don't know that one. So come and tell us the story.
I'm sure I've heard about it before, but
I think I have as well, but it's not coming right. Here's a cheeky comment from Doug. The hotel made a mint from consultants. Well, it did, because honest to goodness, Peter, you wouldn't believe it. Well, you would. There was 120 of us on this change program. It was the biggest change program in Europe at the time, right?
Yeah.
I was there for 3 years. I stayed in a 5-star hotel for 3 years in Bath. That's how I met Doug. He was the barman at the time. Well, he's more than a barman. He was a cocktail genius. He was amazing. And we left, and 2 years later, the team were back.
Yeah.
So we were saving the Ministry of Defence enough money every week, and that's not a misquote, every week, to build a new school, right? 30 million quid a week we were saving them, and within 2 years they'd forgotten it all, and we were back. I mean, it is just ridiculous.
It is.
So there's a couple of other comments.
I hope you gave Doug a decent tip.
Oh, I did. Oh no, I'll tell you, he'll stand up for me, I think. Here's another comment. I found a problem in people pushing that knowledge away with reasons being of innovation and flexible in changing situations. Right, okay. For example, COVID-19 changes. Yeah, what do you think?
And people pushing that knowledge away with reasons of being inflexible. Yeah, I suppose so. I think obviously the most valuable knowledge is that which you can attribute some success to, isn't it? And
yes.
if you're going to look at retaining it, looking to try and capture it by whatever means, whether that be mentoring, storytelling, whatever. The term you used before about communities of action or whatever it was, community of practice. Sorry, yeah. Then you'll only be doing that when it's something that's got some proven value, aren't you? I think some of the stuff around the COVID is so much of it is unknown and untested at the moment that there's always going to be some resistance to it and some interesting dynamic between those who have it and those who don't. So.
Now we've got something I've never had happen on this show before. Derek is joining us to tell us about Fred. Hello, Derek.
Hello,
Derek.
How are you doing?
I've got my grotty camera because my DSLR is sitting on my gimbal, ready to go out and take some pictures in the woods later on.
Excellent. Just so everyone knows, Derek's got a really fancy camera normally, with very fancy backgrounds. So I'm very disappointed in you coming on the show live and not having a fancy background.
Yeah, but that's because the camera's attached to the top of that.
To the gimbal, right. Tell us the Fred story. I'm not sure I know that one, mate. If you don't mind, tell us the story.
Well, to be honest, I don't actually know if the guy really was called Fred, but it was something that was actually part of the literature when I did knowledge management course with the Open University many years ago. And basically what actually happened was Fred, well, let's call him Fred. He may be called Fred, I don't know. Worked for London Underground as they were then, TfL as they are now. He did his 30-odd years, and then he left, as you do. You get your gold watch, and you disappear. And the thing about the Victoria line in London is it's a very, very shallow line. It's not one of the deep lines. And so it twists, and if you've been on it, you'll know it twists and turns quite a bit in certain places because it has to go around the foundations of the buildings. And that has a bit of an effect on the wheels of the trains as they go around. In fact, you'll know when trains go down slowly, you hear the screeching of steel on steel. And what they actually did to combat this was they have a lubrication system, which automatically throws lubricating oil or grease onto the tracks. And as it happens, Peter might be interested, it's actually a company based in Liverpool that supplies the lubricants.
Oh, right.
And they are still there. I looked it up to see who it was. They are still there, and they supply about £250,000 worth of lubricants a year to TfL. So but anyway, so that was the reason for them having the system. But they noticed that after Fred had left, they had a few problems. They started wearing out tracks and problems with wheels and things. And then somebody thought, what actually did Fred do? This is what Fred did. So Fred's job was to fill up the lubricant. Well, so they filled it all up. And then the next time a train went round, 3 years worth of lubricant went everywhere. So Fred's job was not just to fill it up, it was to calibrate it and make sure it did what it was supposed to do. And he had left after 30-odd years, and nobody had bothered finding out what it was he did before he left.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Thanks very much for sharing that. That's excellent. Thanks, Derek. I really appreciate you coming on, mate.
That's a prime example of what I talk about, Scott, which is that it's not just, it needs to focus on high value knowledge, which is not the same as top level knowledge. And again, one of the examples I use is of a colleague of my wife's. Now, my wife works for the clinical commissioning group, and one of her colleagues decided she'd had enough and she was going to leave, but she'd been there from day one, right through the transition from primary care trust to clinical commissioning group. She had corporate memory that no one else had, and she told them that she was going, a bit like Jed. She even invited them to have someone shadow her for the period of her notice because she was incredibly loyal, but nobody took her up on the offer. You know, there was just
wasn't it?
no perceived or no shared notion of what the risk was. And so she just slipped away. And as soon as she did, a bit like Fred's head, you know, the cracks started to appear. You know what? Who does that? Who do we contact? Where's the maintenance? Who do we? And you know, a year later, and those questions were still arising. And it's all for the sake of someone taking a step, you know, recognizing what contribution someone makes, what value someone makes to the organization. And that for me starts with leadership and the performance review or staff appraisal process. And then applying it back, risk assessing the likelihood that that individual and that knowledge is going to be lost and doing something about it. So, you know, any of those responses that we've spoken about so far, you know, so an advanced mentoring scheme, that you know, high-level apprenticeships, storytelling, capture through video, storytelling, and whatever it might be, but capture it, and do something with it, because
it's so bloody obvious, isn't it?
Of course it is. Of course it is. Well, of course, if you risk assess it. And it's not easy to risk assess, but if you do make an effort, and it doesn't have to be terribly complicated, there are some things, there's not much out there about risk assessing knowledge loss, but there are some things out which are a bit overcomplicated, but you don't have to be terribly complicated. Really, you can ask yourself maybe 3 or 4 questions, which is, you know, is this person an outstanding performer? Are they the only person doing the job? So the likes of Fred's head example was the only person doing the job. Are they considered a go-to person in a crisis? And do they have great contacts inside or outside your organization? That gives you an initial prioritization of whether someone's a flight risk, if you like, to coin a phrase. And then you can start doing something about it.
Yeah, I had another thing that I've experienced, and I've nicked it. You know, one of my metaphors is talking about leadership moving from the superhero model, the Steve Jobs model, to being a leader as a gardener. Well, one of that, the genesis of that idea, and a number of people have had the idea. It's not uniquely my idea, but one of the genesis of that for me was I was working. I think it was Marks and Spencer's or Sainsbury's, one of the big retailers, and they had a knowledge garden.
Right.
Now, what they'd done, they had, as Derek suggested earlier, they had used technology to drive this, so it actually didn't work. It died. They didn't water it enough. But I loved the idea of it because you could go on there, Peter, and you could say, right, say it was in, and I mean, I'm just making it up really, but say it was a supply chain issue because obviously in retail, supply chain is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
You could go in there and you could see, you know, key issues that we've encountered. It's almost like you're right. You said right at the beginning, it's this, like the old fashioned risk register when you're doing project management, but it was about how did we get round that issue? You know, and I must try and remember. There was a story about a kink in a line in the fish factory that caused all these issues, and they had got round it somehow. I can't remember why, but I'll have a think, see if I can come back to it. But you're absolutely right. There must be something about this, something we can do about it. But I wanted to ask you another question before because we've done 40 minutes already.
Well,
I know. Is it got something? And I think Doug, in one of his comments earlier, might have hinted at this. Is it got something to do with age or about learning? Now, I don't know if you know, but learning styles is a load of nonsense. It's been sold by snake oil merchants for years, but there is something, certainly for me, that when I'm learning something, and this frustrates the hell out of people, I know that does with me, because I need to learn it myself. If somebody says to me at the beginning, this is how you do it, I go, and I'd rather actually, and I know this is not positive, But I would rather make my own mistakes, and then halfway through it, maybe a mentor can come in and say, Scotty, have you thought about this? You know,
I think there's a difference between making your own mistakes in a sort of a nurturing environment, and actually approaching a task from scratch with no clues, at all. If someone came to us, we know, you and I both know that mankind can put some sort of roving machine on the surface of Mars. And if you gave us a couple of thousand years, maybe you and I would come up with the answers, but it would take a couple of thousand years. You could probably go and join a team who are doing that and make an incredible contribution to what they're actually doing. But you'd have to have some background. You'd have to have some environment in which you could put forward your ideas in, and they would be in context. They'd be in the context of what everyone else was doing. And so, I'm a bit like you. I like to make my own mistakes. I like to do something. And while some learning style stuff might have been debunked, I still think people do learn in a different way. People are different about the way they do things. But yeah, I mean, just thinking about that, I've just been this last day reading this book. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
What's that one? No, I haven't.
Ricardo Semler, Maverick.
Right.
It's about a guy called Ricardo Semler who took over a huge, it's now huge, Brazilian manufacturing company called Semco. I think he also wrote a book called something like this, the 6-Day Weekend, or something similar to that. But basically, all these organizational theories and management theories, he's just like turned them completely on its head. And he talked about creating multifunctional teams where, despite the opposition of the unions, people could do more than one or two or three jobs, and that the whole thing was geared to producing the final product, and it worked. And in terms of things like creating a culture where knowledge is valued, that really did work, because people were working alongside other people, doing different jobs and learning each other's skills all the time. So that question I asked before, is this the only person doing the job? Well, no, it's not. Well, that reduces your risk straight away. I believe, and I've not found it in this book, but I believe that one of its practices was that as you're approaching retirement age at Semco, you don't actually leave. You just go down to 1 day a week. I don't think you actually have to work it, but they pay you for 1 day a week.
Yes.
On the understanding that, well, I'll tell you what, Scott, can you come in next week just for that day? Because we might like to revisit that you used to do there, and perhaps you could share your experience with such and such.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, that's really refreshing. I mean, again, this is another thing that so you can probably tell I'm quite passionate about this, because it used to really wind me up. Alumni, corporate alumni.
Yeah.
Companies are pathetic at it. And they don't understand the value that's in it. I mean, I remember, and this is maybe again a function of changing times. I mean, we've not really covered it. We might have time, but it used to be, again, when I was a personnel officer, that shows my age, at British Gas, right? We had three things that were regarded as the key things. There was the quality of the service. British Gas was the best gas provider in Europe, had the best customer service in Europe, had the cheapest gas in Europe, and then along came Maggie and screwed the whole effing lot of it, right? But the other two things we're very proud of, right, was our welfare policy. We had a massive budget. I mean, it was enormous, and nobody cared about return on investment. We had a happy workforce, right? But the third thing was pensioner relations, because we frequently went back to them and said, "Oh, John, you built the gasometer at Warrington that's just been blown up by the IRA.
Yeah.
This is a real one. I was involved in that, right?
Yeah.
Can you remember how they managed to build that social club that shouldn't have been there? Because literally some idiot had built a social club that shouldn't have been there, right?
Right.
And the IRA used it to get into the gasometer. That's how they got in, right?
Right.
And it was like, and he went, "Oh yeah, I remember that. That was," and we found out how it had happened, right? But companies don't. Maybe companies. Well, they
don't. And there seems to be an over. I've just got to get this out, because it drives me absolutely mad when people say, "Oh, well, yeah, but we do an exit interview." What?
Yeah.
Really? Really? That's like your wife running out the door and saying, "I'm leaving you," and you saying, "But I do love you, honest. Will you come back?" Of course, you're not going to. And this is again back to the business of recognizing people for the value that they bring.
Yeah.
If you recognize someone and tell them, and again, this is just basic leadership. If you tell them, you help us, you do a great job here, your contribution is so good, that Jed, you could take this school from being good to outstanding. Just having that conversation, how happy does it make people? How good does it make them feel to know that they are contributing and making the difference to your business? So it's no good as they're walking out the door saying, "By the way, would you mind coming back every now and again just to help us?" Because they're going to turn around and they're going to say, "You can sod right off. I've got my pension. I'm out the door." I was talking to a very good friend of mine, just very quickly, last weekend, and he was telling me about a guy that he deals with who is a retired, I think he's a patents lawyer. And when he was working, he was making mega money. He was on something like, I don't know, 350 grand a year, for argument's sake.
Yeah.
And he retired. The company he worked for paid him 75 grand a year just to be on a retainer. And in 2 years, he got 2 telephone calls. And the company reckoned that in those 2 telephone calls, he covered his 75 grand a year.
Wow.
Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody retains someone on 75k, but that's about recognizing the value that someone brings. And you don't recognize it if you're not listening. You don't recognize it if you're not asking the right questions. You don't recognize it if you're up against the coal face, chop, chop, busy, busy, work, bang, bang. You've got to take a step back. You've got to speak to your people. You've got to get to know them inside out, recognize the difference they make, and do something about capturing it.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, you just summed the whole thing up beautifully there, Peter. Really good. That has been an incredibly interesting and thought-provoking 45 minutes. And
has it been 45 minutes?
I know, it's just like that. And I've taken off the 5 minutes that Derek was on. So that's 45. Unbelievable. It is an area, though, that, I remember there's a few examples, and there is only a few examples that I've encountered that done quite well. One, oddly, is in academia. Because, I remember my old professor, I think you've probably told me telling stories about him before, but when he retired at 65, he left at 90.
Wow.
So because they couldn't legally, there were some issues with it in the pension schemes and all the rest of it, but they had to ask him to stay because he had the knowledge. Now, he wrote everything down. He was an avid note taker, but it was the connections that he saw. It was the way that he could grab, histology, virology, anatomy, physiology, and suddenly, boom,
make the connection.
Would say that's what the issue was. And the other one I've seen it in is NASA. I remember I was working out in the States, and I was actually working with rocket scientists, which was quite funny. It was completely true. Really funny.
That's not rocket science, is it?
It was amazing. And there was a moment where I was going, "Is this happening?" And there was the NASA guys, some guys from MIT, some guys from the rocket propulsion place, and some guys from believe it or not, the Indian Space Agency. And I'm listening to them, and there was 10 of them in the room, and there was like 3 women, 5 guys, and then me and Samantha, and they were all retired.
Yeah.
And this was a leading edge, forum where they were looking at the future of space, and all of those people in the room were retired. And I spoke to one of the NASA guys, and he said, "You never retire from NASA.
No.
You never retire because we cannot codify your knowledge." So anyway, there's a comment here from, I think it's from Doug. Wow, imagine if leaders actually listened to what you just said and used it.
Well, that's my mission, really. That's my mission. It's funny you should talk about academia, because one of the examples I use in the talk is about Albert Einstein. And when he died in 1955, he left around 80,000 documents when he died. course, one of which was his famous Zurich notebook describing the theory of general relativity. And that's in addition to all the academic seminars he would have had, all the peer reviews, all the discussions he probably had with his fellow scientists. But of course, we don't usually do that if we haven't got those structures in place. And you'd expect those structures to be in place in academia. But why don't we have those structures existing in our own businesses, in our own organizations?
Absolutely.
Because they don't have to be complicated.
No,
it doesn't have to be rocket science, like you say.
Brings us full circle. And I just want to say thank you for coming on again, because that's been brilliant. But that, for me, and it's where I loved your title for this, Lost Knowledge, and I had this immediate thought of Indiana Jones. But one of the things that I encourage people to do, I encourage everybody to do, is to be an archaeologist of your own life. And
very much so.
I was taught, and it was pure luck, by one of the politicians. His name just got right in my head. Great Labour politician. Oh dear, Tony Benn. And Tony Benn did an audio diary every day for pretty much 50 years. I've now done an audio diary every day for 30 years. And that is the richest source. And I mean, I know you've done audio diary, and actually tell people about that. Would you mind? Because I think people would really like it. Your audio recordings.
Yeah. From one of my previous I've walked the Camino de Santiago 3 times by 3 different routes, and at least on 2 of them I've done voice recordings, like a voice journal throughout the day. And I've converted 2 of those into podcasts, or Plodcasts, I call them, with a reference to my walking and former occupation as a police officer. So if you fancy just listening to my ramblings as I wander through the Spanish countryside across Spain and Portugal in search of a spiritual well-being in Camino de Santiago, then have a listen to them. Yeah.
Fantastic, Peter. Now I've got your website here. Is there anything else that, if people wanted to get hold of you, or anything else you want to?
Yeah, I mean the website's more for my after dinner speaking, so you probably won't find a lot of this there. But find me on LinkedIn, and if anyone wants to chat about any of the stuff I've talked about, or wants to contact me by other means, then all the relevant addresses and numbers and things are on LinkedIn. So fill your boots, as they say in Liverpool.
Yes, absolutely. Peter, that's been fantastic. Thanks very much for coming on to Artefact Live again, and you're going to be back again, because I can feel so much more that we could talk about, but it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. What's your view? Last one, nothing to do with this. What's your view on Line of Duty?
Can't watch it. Can't watch it. I believe it's very good. The actors in it are very good. Stephen Graham, who's a Liverpool actor, can't go wrong as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. But it's just too much procedural inaccuracy. I am an absolute nightmare to watch anything like that. So, I'm 5 minutes in and I'm like, no, you couldn't do that. No, you're not allowed
I'll
to.
Tell you what.
No, they'd never do that.
The first 5 series I thought were brilliant. The latest one, I watched it last night, and I got, they call them in Scotland, they call them skelfs. You get, wooden, what they call them, you get bits of wood in your fingers when you touch rough
splinters,
wood. Splinters. Yeah. The acting was so bad, and the writing so shockingly bad, that I was getting splinters. It was terrible. I mean, they kept going, ma'am, boss, ma'am. Honest to God, it was like something at a comedy show. I think they've lost the plot with it.
Isn't that usually the way with television series, though? You know, they're great for the first 3, 4, and then they just start to go a bit mad. Absolutely. Other than Breaking Bad, which was consistently good from start to finish.
Mate. Anyway, we're wittering. Listen, thank you ever so much for coming on, Peter Edge. You're an absolute superstar. I really enjoyed talking to you again. Thanks very much, Peter.
And you, Scott.
Cheers. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And don't believe Peter when he talks about his Plodcast in a sort of slightly off-the-cuff way. It's absolutely lovely. And you get a lovely perspective, not only on the Camino de Santiago and the other Caminos that he's walked, but you get a good insight into what Peter is as a man. So I recommend it to you. And Glasgow Apollo, a.k.a. Andy Muir, has said, would love to do that walk or plod. Yeah. I'm trying to push Peter's arm up his back so I can join him on the Camino one time, because it's one of my objectives in the next 5 years. Here's some feedback for you, Peter, from Doug. Great talk. It was absolutely fantastic. Wasn't that good? So, couple of things. I'm actually going to show a little bit of Peter in action in a minute, because I think there's another side to him that you might not have come across before in this show. So just to remind you what you're doing, this is Scott McArthur. You've been watching ARTEFACTLive, the art and science of storytelling. And before I put the video on, I'd just like you to think about what that phrase that Peter and I both used about being an archaeologist for your own life could mean for you, because I think it's pretty important. But let me just show you this little crazy daft 2-minute video that Peter and I made last time he was on.
And pants down, you're the loser.
Hello and welcome to Artefact. My name's Scott McArthur, and thank you very much for once again joining me on my weekly show. Just to remind those of you who may not have seen the show, where have you been? Story and comedy can shine a light even on the darkest place. But I'd never really heard of Holocaust comedy. Healthy paranoia, because I know what's going to happen. I like the sound of my own voice, but not everybody does. We've got a comedian, and he's a Scouser. And he used to be a copper. Oh dear, says someone on YouTube. It might be interesting to help frame. She does this sort of thing. Good luck following George Carlin. He's a genius. Which one, Peter or George?
Operating your chuckle muscles, as Ken Dodd used to say. It's a thing that's called the callback. It's a serious message. It's couched in humour, but it's the start and the finish are exactly the same. Your Hamish Macbeth types from Northern Constabulary who'd never seen an angry man. And this little voice comes back and it says, I'm sorry there, big fella, I'm not sure, never mind, not sure. Well, I don't know that you can get loads of bifters in airports, they're all over the place. Listen, mate, I'm getting really strung out here, you're going to have to get me some nasty. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know if we've got any nasty. Never mind, you haven't got any nasty. Get me some nasty and get it now or someone's getting shot.
Your baldy head. As they say in Glasgow.
Now that's what I call nasty.
Let's get him in the ground. Chocolate prawns? So that was magic.
It's a rusty nail.
The deep fried Mars bar is a myth.
Big sausage fingers, you know. Hablo un poquito de español.
My life seems really boring compared to yours now, Peter.
yeah.
God.
Start digging.
So hopefully you can see there's another side to Peter that is very much worth watching. And I think the key thing, and you know, I always finish with this if you watch the show, but there is something about being able to tell your own story that acts as what we call an empathy engine. This is why I call my Facebook group an empathy engine, because what we're trying to do is help you understand others and yourself by telling your own story. Because you know what? I think that being an archaeologist in your own life and spotting the stories, and don't say you've not got any stories. I've never met anybody that doesn't have a story. Sometimes I've got to help them, do a little bit of coaching to get the stories out of them. But trust me, everybody has got a story, and that story can change the world. Thanks for tuning in to Artefact Live. I've got plans for next week, but I'm not telling you what they are. So watch this space, and I'll see you next week at Tuesday, 11:30 UK time. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Peter for being my guest. Thanks for Derek for dropping in to Open All Cams. That was great. And I'll see you next week. Good afternoon.